Close your eyes for a moment and picture your wedding day. You are probably imagining a scene straight out of a fairy tale. Soft candlelight, a pristine white dress, the scent of fresh flowers, and a night of private, whispered intimacy with the person you love more than anyone else in the world. It is the happiest day of your life, the culmination of a romance that was meant to be. Now, I want you to take that image, scrunch it up into a ball, and throw it into a muddy, plague-ridden gutter. Because if you were alive in the Middle Ages, your reality would be unrecognizable. In the world we are about to enter, love was often considered a diagnosable mental illness. Marriage was a ruthless business merger signed in ink and sealed in blood. And your wedding night? That wasn't about passion or connection. It was about property, politics, and the desperate, terrifying need to produce an heir before you died at the ripe old age of 40. Welcome to a journey into the smoky, uncomfortable, and surprisingly public bedroom of the Middle Ages. Tonight, we are going to peel back the sheets on history's most secretive yet scrutinized event. We are going to explore a world where priests blessed your bed to ward off demons, where your neighbors watched you undress to ensure you weren't cheating the system, and where if you couldn't perform, you might end up in a courtroom proving your manhood to a judge. But before we step into that room, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and have that notification bell turned on. If you enjoy having your romanticized view of history completely destroyed, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It really helps us share these dark stories with more people. Now, take a deep breath, because we are going back to the beginning. To understand the sheer terror of the medieval wedding night, you have to understand that the nightmare didn't start when the bedroom door closed. It started months, sometimes years earlier, the moment the contract was signed. You see, for the nobility and the rising merchant class of medieval Europe, you didn't marry a person. You married a portfolio of assets. You married a strip of farmland, a herd of sheep, a trade alliance with a neighboring city, or a peace treaty between two warring families. The bride and groom were merely the vessels used to transport these assets from one generation to the next. If you were a young noblewoman in the 12th or 13th century, you were essentially a piece of currency. Your value fluctuated based on your father's political standing and your own physical health. The pressure this placed on the wedding night was immense, because the transaction wasn't considered complete until the marriage was consummated. Imagine the psychological weight of knowing that the peace treaty preventing your father's castle from being burned to the ground depended entirely on what happened between the sheets on your wedding night. That is not romance. That is high-stakes corporate survival. And who were the players in this high-stakes game? This is where modern sensibilities truly collide with medieval reality. The church dictated that the minimum age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Let that sink in for a moment. 12 years old. A girl who had barely entered puberty, who was still physically a child, was suddenly expected to manage a complex household, navigate dangerous political waters, and, most terrifyingly, share a bed with a man who might be 20, 30, or even 40 years her senior. While it is true that many peasants married later, often in their early 20s, simply because they needed time to save up for a cottage, the wealthy didn't have the luxury of time. A daughter was a perishable good. Wait too long, and she might lose her value. Or worse, she might fall in love with the wrong person and ruin the family's plans. So the rush was on. Contracts were often signed while the children were essentially infants, locking them into a destiny they had no voice in choosing. By the time the wedding night arrived, these young people weren't just nervous. They were often strangers to one another, thrown together by the machinations of their parents, and expected to perform an act they barely understood. The financial glue that held this arrangement together was the dowry, This was the payment the bride's family made to the groom to seal the deal. It could be anything from a chest of gold coins to a prime piece of riverfront property. This transaction fundamentally altered the power dynamic of the bedroom. The husband wasn't just receiving a wife. He was receiving a massive infusion of capital. The wife wasn't just entering a partnership. She was the living, breathing receipt for that capital. If the wedding night failed, if the marriage wasn't consummated, or if the bride was found not to be a virgin, that dowry could be contested. It could trigger lawsuits, feuds, and financial ruin. So when you picture the medieval bride standing at the altar, don't picture a blushing woman dreaming of her honeymoon. Picture a terrified teenager carrying the weight of her family's entire economic future on her shoulders. She knew that if she failed to please this stranger, or if she failed to produce the all-important son, she would be considered a bad investment. She would be a failed asset. But the invasion of privacy began long before the wedding night. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly in rural England, there existed a custom known as hand-fasting. This was a betrothal ceremony, a verbal contract often exchanged at the village crossroads or the alehouse, which was considered almost as binding as the church wedding. The strange paradox here is that in many communities, a hand-fasted couple was socially permitted to start sleeping together before the official wedding. It was a sort of try before you buy policy that seems incredibly pragmatic for a society supposedly obsessed with purity. However, this custom was a double-edged sword, especially for women. If a couple was hand-fasted, slept together, and the woman became pregnant, the wedding was simply rushed forward and the child was legitimate. But what if the man changed his mind? What if, after the trial run, he decided the match wasn't to his liking? The woman was then left in a disastrous position. She was spoiled goods in the eyes of society, her value as a bride destroyed, with very little legal recourse. This created a culture of extreme paranoia and surveillance. Families watched their daughters with hawk-like intensity, not necessarily out of moral piety, but to protect the investment value of that dowry. Every interaction was monitored, every glance analyzed. The idea of private time for a courting couple was non-existent because the risks were simply too high. Then came the final public audit, the reading of the banns. For 3 consecutive Sundays before the wedding, the local priest would stand in the pulpit and announce the upcoming marriage to the entire congregation. He would demand in a booming voice that anyone who knew of any reason why these two should not be wed must speak up now. Today, we view this as a quaint formality. In the Middle Ages, it was an invitation for chaos. It was a chance for every gossip, every jealous rival, and every enemy of the family to come forward with accusations. Is he already promised to a woman in the next shire? Are they too closely related? Is she actually pregnant by the blacksmith's son? The couple had to endure weeks of this public scrutiny. Their private lives were dissected in the town square and the tavern. By the time the wedding day actually arrived, the entire village felt they had a stake in the union. They had debated it, analyzed it, and approved it. And because they had approved it, they felt entitled to ensure it was finalized. This is a crucial psychological point to understand. In the medieval mind, a marriage wasn't real until it was physically consummated. Therefore, the consummation wasn't a private act. It was the final stamp on a public document, and the public intended to witness that stamp being placed. Adding to this anxiety was a profound ignorance about how the human body actually worked. Sex education in the Middle Ages was a mix of superstition, barnyard observation, and ancient Greek philosophy that had been twisted by centuries of mistranslation. Young men and women were fed a diet of terrifying myths. They were taught that the body was governed by the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, sanity, and reproduction depended on keeping these fluids in balance. Men were often taught that retaining their seed for too long was physically dangerous, that it could poison their blood or drive them mad. The wedding night, therefore, was framed as a medical necessity, a way to purge the body of dangerous toxins. Women, on the other hand, were viewed through a lens of suspicion and fear. They were often described by physicians as being cold and wet by nature, requiring the heat of a man to function correctly. But simultaneously, the Church taught that, while sex was necessary for procreation, enjoying it too much was a sin. It was a tightrope walk over the pits of hell. You had to perform the act to save your family line, but if you engaged in it with too much lust, you were endangering your immortal soul. And if you did it at the wrong time, during a holy day, or while menstruating, or in the wrong position, you risked conceiving a child that might be born deformed or possessed. Imagine the confusion swirling in the mind of a young groom. He is told that he must perform to secure the dowry. He is told he must perform to balance his humors and stay healthy. But he is also told that the woman lying next to him is a temptress, a daughter of Eve who might lead him into sin. And he is told all of this while knowing that outside the door, his father, his father-in-law, and half the village are waiting for proof that he has done the job. As the wedding day finally dawned, the atmosphere was less like a celebration and more like a countdown. The ceremony itself often took place at the church door, where the property exchange was announced loudly to the crowd. Business first, God second. Then came the Mass, and finally the feast. But for the couple sitting at the high table, the feast was an ordeal. While the guests gorged themselves on roasted meats and guzzled strong ale, getting louder and rowdier by the hour, the bride and groom often sat in terrified silence. The jokes would start flying. Crude, bawdy, aggressive jokes about what was to come. Guests would place bets on the groom's stamina or the bride's virtue. This wasn't considered bullying, it was tradition. It was part of the ritual humiliation designed to break down the barriers of privacy. The ale flowed, the music played, and the tension mounted. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the torches were lit, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. The noise of the party would reach a fever pitch until finally, the cry would go up from the best man, or the bride's father. A cry that signaled the end of the public festivities and the beginning of the public ordeal. "To the bed! To the bed!" This was the moment. The contract was signed, the money paid, the banns read, and the feast eaten. Now the transaction had to be sealed in flesh. But as the couple was steered toward the bedchamber, they realized the most horrifying truth of the night. They weren't going in there alone. The priest was coming with them. The parents were coming with them. The musicians were coming with them. And the drunken guests? They certainly weren't going to miss the show. The door to the bedroom swings open, and the real performance is about to begin. The cry, "To the bed!" still echoes in the great hall, bouncing off the stone walls and mingling with the raucous laughter of the guests. If this were a modern wedding, this would be the moment the couple makes a graceful exit, perhaps waving from a getaway car as they drive off into a private future. But in the 13th century, there is no getaway car, there is no exit, and there is certainly no privacy. Instead of a retreat, what happens next is an invasion. The entire wedding party, drunk on strong ale and adrenaline, surges forward. This isn't a polite escort, It is a riotous procession known as the Bedding March. Musicians blast their instruments, bagpipes, drums, and shrill flutes, creating a cacophony designed to be as loud as physically possible. This wall of noise served a dual purpose. On the surface, it was a celebration, a way to hype up the crowd. But on a deeper, more superstitious level, the noise was a weapon. Medieval people believed that demons and malevolent spirits were attracted to moments of transition, and nothing was more transitional than the loss of virginity. The noise was intended to scare away these unseen entities, to clear the spiritual air before the physical act could take place. So, imagine you are the bride. You are deafened by bagpipes, grabbed by the arms by your bridesmaids and your mother, and practically dragged up the stairs or across the courtyard to the bridal chamber. The groom is undergoing a similar ordeal, surrounded by his groomsmen, a term that originally implied men who helped the groom prepare for battle or bed, who are slapping his back, making lewd suggestions, and offering last-minute, often terrible advice on how to perform. When the doors to the bedchamber are thrown open, the first thing that hits you is the heat. To make the room romantic and welcoming, the fireplace has likely been roaring for hours. But combined with the sudden influx of 30, 40, or 50 people into a small, enclosed space, the air instantly becomes stifling. It smells of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, roasting meat from the feast, and the heavy, cloying scent of incense or dried herbs like rosemary and lavender, which were scattered on the floor to mask the less pleasant odors of medieval life. But before the couple can even think about the bed, the church has one final piece of business to conduct. And this is where the cognitive dissonance of the medieval mind is at its most fascinating. Standing by the bed, often in full vestments, is the priest. Yes, the same man who preaches about the sins of the flesh and the virtue of celibacy is now the master of ceremonies for the sex act. The priest isn't just there to observe, he is there to perform an exorcism of the furniture. In the medieval worldview, the bed was a dangerous object. It was where people were born, where they sickened, and where they died. It was a portal between worlds. Before a marriage could be consummated, the bed had to be purified. The priest would sprinkle holy water on the mattress, the pillows, and the sheets. He would recite specific prayers, asking God to banish the demons of the night, the incubi and succubi, that were believed to prey on sleeping humans and steal their seed or corrupt their wombs. Think about the psychological impact of this on two young, inexperienced people. You are standing there, waiting to be intimate, and a holy man is literally shaking water onto your pillows and praying that a demon doesn't materialize to curse your genitals. It reinforces the idea that what you are about to do is dangerous, a battlefield where your soul and your body are at risk. The priest might also sense the room, swinging a thurible of burning incense into the corners, chanting in Latin, Benedic Domine, thalamum hunc. Bless, O Lord, this bridal chamber. The room is now a sacred space, an altar where the sacrifice of virginity is about to be offered. Once the bed is blessed, the ritual of undressing begins. And ritual is the correct word. You didn't just take off your clothes. You were unmade. For the nobility, clothing was complex. Layers of linen, wool, silk, laces, points, and girdles. It took time to put on, and it took time to take off. The bride was surrounded by her ladies. They would strip away her veil, her outer gown, her kirtle, and her shift, often making a show of it for the male guests who were craning their necks to see. This wasn't a private moment of vulnerability. It was a striptease performed by committee. As each layer was removed, the guests would cheer, critique, or make body comparisons. The groom, meanwhile, was being stripped by his men on the other side of the room. There was often a competitive element to this. Which group could get their charge naked and into the bed first? But they didn't get completely naked. Not yet. In many traditions, the couple would keep their headgear on. A coif for the man, a caul or veil for the woman. There is something profoundly unsexy about standing stark naked except for a linen bonnet tied under your chin. But in the medieval mind, the head was the seat of the soul and needed protection. Or perhaps it was just the last shred of dignity they were allowed to keep. As the clothes came off, the medicines came out. This is the part of the evening where medieval science tried to lend a helping hand. The pressure to consummate was so high that performance anxiety was a genuine concern. To combat this, the couple was often served a special drink known as a caudle or hippocras. This was a mixture of wine, milk, eggs, sugar, and spices like cinnamon, ginger, and saffron. These spices were incredibly expensive, literally worth their weight in gold, and were believed to be powerful aphrodisiacs because they were hot and dry in nature, which supposedly stimulated the blood and the libido. The couple was forced to drink this thick, sweet, spicy sludge while sitting up in bed, naked from the neck down, with the entire room watching them swallow. "Drink up," the guests would urge. "You'll need your strength." It was essentially medieval Viagra, administered publicly. If the wine wasn't enough, there were the foods. The wedding feast might have included specific dishes designed to encourage the seed. These included things that modern diners might find repulsive. Sparrow brains, because sparrows were seen as lusty birds. Bull testicles, or roots like eringo and satirion, which were thought to resemble human genitalia, and therefore, by the logic of sympathetic magic, would strengthen those same parts in the eater. Once the couple was finally in the bed, sitting up against the pillows, drinking their spiced wine, the crowd didn't leave. Oh no, the entertainment was just peaking. Now came the ritual of throwing the stocking. This is the chaotic ancestor of the modern bouquet toss, but instead of flowers, they used dirty laundry. The guests would take the bride's and groom's stockings, the long socks they had just worn all day, and sit at the foot of the bed. One by one, the guests would take turns throwing a stocking over their shoulder, blindly aiming for the couple's heads. The rules were simple. If a male guest threw the stocking and it landed on the bride's head, he would be the next to marry. If a female guest hit the groom, she was next. Imagine the scene. You are huddled under the covers, trying to maintain some modesty, while your drunk friends and relatives are pelting you with heavy wool socks, screaming with laughter every time they score a direct hit on your face. It was humiliating, it was rowdy, and it completely destroyed any lingering sense of romance or solemnity. But beneath the laughter, there was a serious undercurrent. This ritual was about contagion. The medievals believed that luck and fertility were contagious. By touching the couple's intimate clothing, by invading their bed space, the community was trying to siphon off a little bit of the magic for themselves. The couple in the bed were totems of fertility. They ceased to be individuals. They were public property, lucky charms to be touched and targeted. Depending on the region and the social status, this preparation phase could drag on for an hour or more. The body jokes would get cruder. The physical contact would get more intrusive. Guests might try to pull the covers down to check the goods one last time. The groom's friends might tie bells to the underside of the bed frame so that everyone would know when the movement began. It was a hazing ritual, pure and simple. Finally, usually at the insistence of the parents, who wanted the deed done and the contract sealed, or perhaps the priest, who felt the line of decency was being crossed, the room would begin to clear. But even this wasn't a clean break. The guests wouldn't just leave and shut the door. They would retreat slowly, often singing lewd songs as they went. The parents might stay behind for a final word, a last bit of pressure. "Remember," the father might whisper to the groom, "the land depends on this." "Remember," the mother might hiss to the bride, "don't make a sound, just endure it." And then, the curtains of the bed would be drawn. The heavy velvet or wool curtains that surrounded medieval beds weren't just for decoration. They were the only walls that offered any privacy in a house full of people. The room within a room. But as the heavy wooden door of the chamber finally thudded shut and the latch clicked, the couple wasn't truly alone. They knew that just on the other side of that door, or perhaps at the bottom of the stairs, the party was continuing. They knew that people were listening. In some traditions, the witnesses would actually stay in the room, quietly retreating to the shadows or sitting by the fire to ensure that no trickery took place. The silence that fell over the bed after the door closed was heavy. It was the silence of two people who had been paraded, inspected, blessed, stripped, and mocked, now facing the reality of their physical bodies in the dark. The adrenaline of the crowd was fading, replaced by the cold, hard realization of what had to happen next. The business deal was signed. The church had given its permission. The community had had its fun. Now, there was nothing left but the biology. The groom, possibly drunk on spiced wine and terrified of failing, looked at the bride, possibly terrified of the pain she had been warned about. The romantic wedding night was a myth. What lay ahead was a job, a duty, a performance. And as they shifted on the mattress, they might have heard the rustle of straw beneath them, a reminder that they were just creatures of the earth, about to engage in the most basic, animalistic act of survival. But what happens when the curtains close? What actually happened in the dark? And why did the church have a manual of instructions for this exact moment? We are about to step into the most forbidden territory of all. The heavy oak door has finally slammed shut. The latch has clicked. The chaotic symphony of bagpipes, drunken shouting, and obscene advice has been muffled by the thick wood and stone. For the first time in perhaps their entire lives, the bride and groom are technically alone. But alone is a relative term in the Middle Ages. As the couple lies in the darkness, the silence isn't peaceful. It is heavy with expectation. They know that just on the other side of that door, the party is not over. In fact, it is likely transformed into a surveillance operation. It was common practice for the groomsmen, the groom's closest friends, to linger in the hallway, pressing their ears against the wood, waiting for the telltale creak of the bed ropes or the sound of movement that would signal the consummation had begun. In some particularly intrusive traditions, they would wait for a signal, a shout or a knock from the groom, to confirm that the deed was done, so they could rush back downstairs and announce the news to the waiting parents. So, the privacy is an illusion. But the eavesdroppers in the hallway are the least of the couple's problems. Because as they lie there, staring up into the canopy of the bed, they are acutely aware that there is a third person in the bed with them. An invisible, judgmental, and terrifyingly powerful entity. The Holy Catholic Church. We often think of the medieval church as an institution of stone cathedrals and Latin Mass. But its real power lay in its ability to colonize the human mind. specifically the bedroom. The Church had spent centuries developing a complex, contradictory, and anxiety-inducing manual for how married people were allowed to have sex. This wasn't just advice, it was law, spiritual law. And violating it could result in penance, excommunication, or the birth of a cursed child. The couple knows that what they are about to do is a legal necessity. In medieval law, a marriage was not binding until it was consummated. Commixtio sexuum, the commingling of sexes. Without this act, the contract was void, the dowry could be reclaimed, and the alliance broken. So, the pressure to perform is immense. But here is the trap. While they must do it to satisfy the law, if they enjoy it too much, they are committing a sin. The Church taught that lust, luxuria, was one of the 7 deadly sins. And crucially, they taught that you could commit the sin of lust with your own spouse. Pope Gregory the Great had famously written that if a husband had sex with his wife for the sheer pleasure of it, he was treating her like an adulteress. The act had to be stoic. It had to be functional. It was a transaction for the production of children, not a recreational activity. Imagine the psychological state of the groom. He needs to be physically aroused to perform the act that saves his family's fortune. But he has been taught from childhood that the very feeling of arousal is a sign of moral corruption. It is a recipe for catastrophic performance anxiety. And if the why wasn't complicated enough, the how was rigidly policed. The Church had very specific ideas about geometry. The only acceptable position was the natural position. Man on top, woman on bottom. This wasn't just a preference, it was a theological mandate. They believed this reflected the natural order of the universe. God over man, man over woman. Any variation from this was viewed with horror. The retro position, or entering from behind, was considered dog-like and beastly. It was believed that adopting animalistic positions might literally cause the resulting child to be born with animal characteristics, fur, tails, or deformities. Oral and manual stimulation were strictly forbidden, classified as crimes against nature, often punishable by years of fasting and penance on bread and water. The penitentials, handbooks used by priests to assign punishments during confession, were obsessively detailed about these sexual variations. So, the couple in the bed isn't just exploring each other's bodies, they are navigating a minefield of potential sins. But the most terrifying obstacle for the medieval couple wasn't the position. It was the calendar. If you were a pious medieval Christian trying to follow every rule, finding a night where you were actually allowed to sleep with your wife was a mathematical nightmare. The Church prohibited sex on all feast days and Sundays because it was the Lord's Day. You couldn't have sex on Wednesdays and Fridays because those were days of fasting and penance. You certainly couldn't have sex during Lent, the 40 days before Easter, during Advent, the weeks before Christmas, or during the Pentecost. But wait, there's more. You were forbidden from having sex while the woman was unclean, meaning during menstruation, and often for a period after childbirth, sometimes up to 40 days. Some strict interpretations even forbade sex during pregnancy or while nursing. When historians tally it all up, a strictly observant medieval couple might have been forbidden from sexual relations for nearly 40 to 50% of the year. The wedding date itself had to be carefully chosen to dodge these blackout dates. But biology doesn't always follow the calendar. If the wedding night happened to fall on a Thursday night that bled into a Friday fast, or if the bride's cycle arrived unexpectedly due to stress, the couple faced a crisis. Do they disobey God, or do they disobey their families, waiting for the blood-stained sheets? Most chose to disobey God, whispering a quick prayer for forgiveness before getting on with the business of the night. Then there was the fear of the monstrous. The medieval understanding of genetics was a blend of folklore and terror. They believed that the state of mind of the parents during conception directly shaped the child. If the couple was drunk, which they likely were from the feast, the child could be born feeble-minded. If they were angry, the child would be violent. If they looked at something ugly during the act, the child would be ugly. This placed a horrific burden on the imagination. The couple had to maintain pure, holy thoughts while engaging in a physical act, all while drunk, exhausted, and under surveillance. And let's talk about the specific goal of the night: the heir, the male heir. In a society based on primogeniture, inheritance by the firstborn son, a daughter was a disappointment. A son was a triumph. Medieval medical manuals were full of bizarre advice on how to ensure a boy. The most common theory, dating back to ancient Greece but popular in medieval folklore, involved the right versus left dichotomy. It was believed that the seed from the right testicle produced boys, because the right side was considered strong, hot, and masculine, while the left testicle produced girls, weak, cold, and feminine. So, you would have grooms who had actually tied a cord or a ribbon around their left testicle before getting into bed, believing that by cutting off the girl supply, they would guarantee a son. Imagine the physical discomfort and the sheer absurdity of trying to consummate a marriage with a tourniquet on your anatomy, all based on a misunderstanding of biology that wouldn't be corrected for another 500 years. For the bride, the terror was more immediate and physical. We must address the pain. In a world without lubricants, where hygiene was questionable, and where the groom was likely drunk and rushing to finish the job, the deflowering was expected to be painful. In fact, pain was the point. The pain was the proof. The medieval obsession with virginity was pathological. The bride knew that the next morning the sheets would be inspected. We will get to the morning after inspection in the next chapter, but the anticipation of it hovered over the bed like a ghost. If she didn't bleed, she could be accused of being corrupted, a whore, a damaged good. This led to desperate measures. Historical records and women's secrets texts hint at the dark reality of women who, knowing they might not bleed, perhaps due to rigorous physical labor, riding horses, or previous trauma, would bring a vial of chicken blood or a pricked finger into the bed with them. They had to fake the evidence of their own pain to survive the social judgment of the morning. On the other hand, the groom had his own performance anxiety nightmare: the curse of the ligature, or knot. Impotence was one of the few grounds for annulment in the Middle Ages. If a man couldn't perform, the marriage could be declared null and void, as if it never happened. Medieval people didn't attribute impotence to stress or alcohol. They attributed it to sorcery. They believed that a witch or a jealous ex-lover could cast a spell, tying a knot in a piece of string while chanting the groom's name, which would magically tie up his manhood. This fear was so prevalent that men would inspect the bed for hidden knots, amulets, or cursed objects before getting in. Every failure of erection wasn't just a physical embarrassment. It was evidence of spiritual warfare. As the night wore on, the candle would burn down to a stub. The heat of the room would dissipate, leaving the cold stone air to settle in. The couple, having navigated the minefield of sin, expectations, eavesdroppers, and biological myths, would finally collapse into sleep. But they couldn't sleep for long, because the sun would rise, and with the sun came the reckoning. The door that had been shut to give them privacy would be thrown open again. The priest would return. The parents would return, and the village would demand to see the receipts. The act was done, but the proof was yet to be verified. In the next episode, we will examine the humiliating ritual of the morning gift and the inspection of the sheets, where a stain of blood was worth more than a chest of gold. The sun has barely crested the horizon, casting a pale gray light through the narrow arrow slits of the castle window or the cracks in the peasant's cottage wall. For the couple in the bed, the night is over, but the ordeal is not. In fact, for the bride specifically, the most dangerous moment of the entire wedding process has just arrived. You might think that after the exhausting rituals of the previous day, the feasting, the bedding ceremony, the exorcism of the mattress, and the act itself, the couple would be allowed to sleep in, perhaps enjoy a quiet morning of recovery. But remember, medieval privacy is a myth. The silence of the dawn is shattered not by a rooster, but by the heavy thud of the door being thrown open. They are back. The parents, the witnesses, the priest, and in some traditions, the entire village is waiting just downstairs, hungover but eager for news. They haven't come to wish the couple a good morning. They have come to audit the transaction. They have come for the sheets. This is the moment of the morning reckoning. In the medieval mind, the consummation of a marriage wasn't a private matter between two souls. It was the final signature on a legal contract. And like any contract, it required physical proof. The focus of everyone entering that room is laser-locked on one thing: the linen sheet beneath the bride. They are looking for the tokens of virginity: blood. To the modern mind, this inspection is invasive, medically inaccurate, and deeply disturbing. But to the medieval mind, that stain of red was the most valuable commodity in the room. It was worth more than the gold in the groom's purse or the land in the bride's dowry. If the sheet was stained, a cheer would go up. The marriage was valid. The alliance was secure. The bride was pure, and the groom was potent. In some cultures across medieval Europe, this sheet was literally taken off the bed and paraded out the window or displayed on the balcony to the cheering crowd below. It was a flag of victory. But what if the sheet was white? This is where the morning turns into a nightmare. A clean sheet was a catastrophe. It suggested one of two things, and both were disastrous. First, it could mean the bride was not a virgin, that she was damaged goods, a whore who had tricked the groom into a bad deal. This could be grounds for immediate annulment, public shaming, or even the return of the dowry, which would bankrupt her family. Second, it could mean the groom had failed to perform, that the marriage was unconsummated. In a hyper-masculine society, this was a humiliation from which a man might never recover. Because the stakes were so high, the morning reckoning birthed a secret industry of deception. Mothers and midwives, knowing that biology is not always consistent and that a virgin might not necessarily bleed, often equipped their daughters with insurance policies before they entered the bridal chamber. Medieval women's secrets, texts, and court records hint at vials of chicken blood hidden in bedside tables, or the prick of a needle on a finger or thigh just moments before the door opened. It was a conspiracy of women against a patriarchal system that demanded biological proof for a social construct. The bride had to be an actress in her own bed, staging the scene to save her reputation and her family's honor. Once the proof was accepted, the tension in the room would break. The atmosphere would shift from scrutiny to celebration. And this brings us to the second most important part of the morning, the Morgengabe, or the morning gift. While the bride sat up in bed, likely exhausted and mortified by the inspection of her linens, the groom was expected to present her with a substantial gift. This wasn't a sentimental trinket like a bouquet of flowers or a box of chocolates. This was a serious financial transaction. The Morgengabe was a payment. Historians often call it the price of virginity. In many Germanic and English laws, this gift was legally the separate property of the wife. It was her safety net. It could be a bag of gold, a specific piece of jewelry, or even a deed to a piece of land. Crucially, this was often the only property a medieval woman officially owned that her husband couldn't easily take away. But notice the timing. He didn't give it to her at the altar. He gave it to her after the night was over. It was conditional. No performance, no payment. It reinforced the brutal reality that the wife's sexuality was a service she provided, and the Morgengabe was the fee. After the gift was given and the sheets were dealt with, the couple was finally allowed to rise. But the physical ordeal wasn't over. They were immediately served another round of the bridal caudle, that thick, spicy, alcoholic milk soup we mentioned in Part 2. The guests would crowd around, watching them drink it, making lewd jokes about replenishing their strength for the nights to come. The groom was slapped on the back. The bride was kissed and pinched. They were now full members of the adult community. Then came the show. The couple had to get dressed, again with the help of the audience, and make their first public appearance as man and wife. Walking into the great hall for the morning meal was a theatrical performance. Every eye was on them. Guests were analyzing their gait, their facial expressions, their interactions. Did she look happy? Did he look proud? Did they look exhausted? The gossip network of the medieval village was faster than any modern social media platform. By noon, everyone from the scullery maid to the stable boy would have an opinion on how the wedding night went. But beneath the public celebration, there was often a lingering sense of religious guilt. Remember, the church hovered over every aspect of medieval life. Even though the marriage was legal and the act was necessary for procreation, the couple had just engaged in lust. To the pious medieval mind, they were now spiritually unclean. In many communities, a newlywed couple was not allowed to enter the church immediately after the wedding night. They were considered to be in a state of ritual impurity. They might have to wait a day, wash themselves, and pray for forgiveness before they could take communion again. It's a dizzying psychological contradiction. Society demands you have sex to be a valid citizen, but the church demands you feel bad about it to be a good Christian. This morning after ritual served a crucial function in medieval society. It was the transition point. The night before, they were two individuals, a boy and a girl, children of their fathers. The morning after, they were a unit, a political entity, a potential mother and father. The stained sheet was the banner under which they would march into their future. However, everything we have described so far assumes the best-case scenario. It assumes the groom was able to perform. It assumes the bride was able to fake it or bleed. It assumes the deception worked and the families were satisfied. But what happened when it didn't work? What happened when the door opened and the groom sat there, head in his hands, while the bride sat silently on the other side of the bed? What happened when the magic knot of impotence couldn't be untied? What happened when a woman, terrified and desperate, realized she was trapped in a marriage with a man who physically couldn't consummate the union? In the modern world, this would be a private tragedy, perhaps discussed in a therapist's office or a lawyer's conference room. In the Middle Ages, sexual failure wasn't a private matter. It was a public crime. It was a breach of contract. And like any breach of contract, it had to be litigated. If the morning sun revealed failure, the couple didn't just face embarrassment. They faced the courtroom. You are about to enter the most bizarre, intrusive, and humiliating legal proceedings in human history. Forget the bedding ceremony. That was just a party. We are moving toward the impotence trials, where the courtroom became the bedroom, where judges ordered searchers to inspect male genitalia with clinical coldness, and where couples were sometimes ordered to perform the act in front of witnesses to prove their case. The wedding night is over. The honeymoon is canceled. The trial is about to begin. The confetti has been swept away. The guests have gone home. The music has faded. But inside the castle or the cottage, a heavy, suffocating silence has descended. Weeks have passed, perhaps months, and the bride's belly remains flat. The sheets remain stubbornly white. The dynastic alliance, the exchange of land, the future of the family name, it is all crumbling. In the modern world, a couple facing intimacy issues might seek counseling or quietly separate. But in the Middle Ages, marriage was an iron cage. The Catholic Church taught that what God has joined, let no man put asunder. Divorce, as we know it, did not exist. You were married until death, period. Unless you could prove that the marriage never actually happened. Welcome to the legal loophole of the Middle Ages, annulment. And the most common, most humiliating route to an annulment was an accusation of impotence. This is where the tragedy of the bedroom becomes the comedy of the courtroom. We are transitioning from a private failure to a public scandal. When a wife, or her ambitious father, decided to end a marriage because the husband couldn't perform, she didn't just pack her bags. She had to go to the bishop's court and formally accuse her husband of being frigid by nature. Imagine the scene. A crowded ecclesiastical court. Scribes with quills poised, bishops in high robes. And there, standing in the dock, is the husband. He isn't being accused of murder or theft. He is being accused of having a useless member. His private anatomy is now a matter of public record. But the husband had a defense that sounds insane to us, but was a valid legal argument in the 13th century. He could claim maleficium, witchcraft. He would stand before the judge and say, "My lord, I am not naturally impotent. I am a virile man, but a witch has tied a knot in a cord." This refers to the ligature, a curse we touched upon earlier. The husband would argue that a jealous ex-lover or a malicious neighbor had cast a spell that specifically froze his ability only with his wife. He might claim he could perform perfectly well with other women, a risky admission, but one that proved his machinery worked, but that with her, he was bewitched. This distinction was crucial. If he was naturally impotent, the marriage was void, and he was humiliated for life. If he was bewitched, he was a victim, and the church might give him time to break the spell through prayer, exorcism, or pilgrimage. It turned the courtroom into a battleground of theology and biology. But the church, for all its superstition, was also a bureaucracy. They liked proof. They couldn't just take the wife's word that nothing was happening, nor the husband's word that he was cursed. They needed evidence, hard, physical evidence. So, the court ordered an investigation. This brings us to the searchers, or the jury of matrons. This is one of the most invasive legal procedures in history. The court would appoint a group of honest women, usually respectable widows, midwives, or matrons of the community, to serve as experts. Their job? To physically inspect the husband's genitalia. Picture the humiliation. The husband is taken into a private room, or sometimes a vestry. He is ordered to strip. 7 or 8 grim-faced elderly women surround him. These aren't doctors. They are the neighborhood grandmothers. And they are there to touch, measure, and stimulate him to see if he is capable of an erection. They would examine the size, the shape, and the color of his member. They would look for signs of disease or deformity. And yes, legal records from places like York and Paris detail how these women would try to warm the man to see if there was any reaction. Imagine trying to prove your virility in a cold stone room, surrounded by a panel of judges who look like your mother-in-law, while your entire financial future hangs in the balance. It is the stuff of nightmares. If the searchers emerged from the room shaking their heads, reporting that the member was null or small and useless, the husband's case was effectively dead. He would be declared impotent. The wife would be granted an annulment. She would get her dowry back, the land, the money, the sheep, and she would be free to marry someone else. The husband, however, would be branded. He would likely be forbidden from ever marrying again, because if he couldn't perform with one woman, the church assumed he couldn't perform with any. He was a genetic dead end. But the investigation didn't stop at the man. The wife was also under the microscope. If she claimed the marriage was unconsummated, she had to prove she was still a virgin. So the same jury of matrons would turn their attention to her. They would inspect her body with the same clinical, invasive curiosity. They were looking for the physical signs of virginity, the hymen. If they found her to be intact, it was powerful evidence against the husband. It meant that, despite living together for months or years, he had failed to penetrate the fortress. However, medieval anatomy was confused. The searchers often got it wrong. There are court cases where women were declared virgins only to be found pregnant months later, or cases where intact women were actually just anatomically different. But in the eyes of the law, the word of these honest women was gospel. This process created a toxic environment of bribery and corruption. A wealthy husband might bribe the matrons to say he was sufficient. A desperate wife might bribe them to say he was useless. The bedroom secrets of the couple became the currency of the village gossip mill, and sometimes the results were inconclusive. The matrons would come out and say, "We don't know." Maybe the man seemed fine, but the wife insisted nothing happened. Maybe the wife seemed like a virgin, but the man swore he had done the deed. It was a he said, she said of the highest order. When testimony failed, and when physical inspection failed, the church had one final nuclear option. A legal procedure so bizarre, so voyeuristic, and so shocking that it became infamous across Europe. It was the ultimate tiebreaker. If the couple couldn't agree on whether the husband could perform, the judge would order them to prove it. In action. This was the trial by Congress. The court would order the couple to have sex, but not in private. They would have to do it in a neutral location, surrounded by witnesses, doctors, midwives, and sometimes even lawyers, who would stand by the bed to verify, beyond a shadow of a doubt, whether penetration occurred and whether emission happened. It sounds like a dark satire, but for centuries, particularly in France and Spain, this was a real legal proceeding. A husband fighting for his reputation and his property would be given one chance, 1 hour, one scheduled appointment to perform the act of love in front of a live audience of legal experts. As we move to the final chapter of our story, we are going to witness this spectacle. We will see how a trial by Congress actually worked, the immense pressure it placed on the human psyche, and how this bizarre obsession with the mechanics of sex eventually collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. The matrons have made their report. The lawyers have made their arguments. Now the curtains are opening for the final, humiliating performance. This is it, the ultimate humiliation. We have traveled from the signing of the contract, through the noisy bedding ceremony, past the bloody inspection of the sheets, and through the invasive groping of the jury of matrons. And now, we have arrived at the absolute nadir of medieval dignity. The courtroom has failed to reach a verdict. The witnesses are unreliable. The physical inspections were inconclusive. So, the judge has ordered the nuclear option. The couple has been sentenced to a trial by Congress. In the history of human law, there is perhaps no proceeding more grotesque than this. The term Congress here is a polite euphemism for sexual intercourse. The court has essentially ordered the husband and wife to perform the act of love under laboratory conditions, with a team of legal and medical experts standing just a few feet away, watching, timing, and taking notes. Imagine the scene. It is not the couple's own bedroom. That was deemed too comfortable, too prone to trickery. They are ordered to a neutral location. Often this was a bathhouse, a designated room in a bishop's palace, or the home of a court-appointed midwife. The bed is not a soft feather mattress. It is often a simple cot, stripped of heavy curtains to ensure maximum visibility. The audience enters. These are not drunken wedding guests cheering for their friends. These are grim-faced doctors, surgeons, midwives, and officers of the court. Their job is not to celebrate. It is to verify. They check the room for hidden amulets. They check the bed for hidden devices. They strip the couple naked and inspect them one last time to ensure no instruments of deception are being used. And then the command is given. Proceed. Put yourself in the shoes of the husband. Your entire life, your reputation, your land, your title, your ability to ever marry again hangs on this single moment. But you are naked, cold, and surrounded by elderly strangers who are staring at your groin with clinical impatience. The psychological pressure is crushing. It is the ultimate definition of performance anxiety. And for the wife, the horror is equally profound. She is lying there, exposed to the eyes of strange men, waiting for a husband she has likely already accused of being useless. She is a participant in a public experiment on her own body. The experts are looking for three specific things, the holy trinity of medieval consummation: erection, penetration, and emission. If any one of these three elements is missing, the trial is a failure. History records these trials with excruciating detail. In 16th and 17th century France, where this practice reached its peak mania, doctors would actually argue over the quality of the performance. Was the entry sufficient? Was the emission laudable, meaning substantial enough to create life? Scribes would literally write down the duration of the attempt. The couple might be given an hour or two. If nothing happened in that time, the judge would step in and declare the husband impotent. And failure was the most common outcome. Because biology is not a machine. Under such extreme stress, the human body shuts down. The fight or flight response kicks in, redirecting blood flow away from where it is needed to the muscles for escape. So the very mechanism the court was trying to test was sabotaged by the testing method itself. When the time was up and the husband lay there defeated, the verdict was swift and brutal. The Congress had failed. The marriage was declared null and void from the beginning. It was as if it never existed. But the consequences were very real. For the woman, this was often a victory, albeit a traumatic one. She was granted an annulment. She reclaimed her dowry, the land, the money, the livestock her father had given. She was legally declared a virgin, or at least unmarried, and was free to marry another man. In fact, many historians suspect that ambitious families used these impotence trials as a weapon to get their daughters out of bad political alliances so they could marry up. For the man, however, it was a death sentence for his lineage. He was legally branded with permanent frigidity. He was forbidden from remarrying. The logic was simple. If he couldn't perform with his first wife, the church assumed he was broken. He was a genetic dead end. He would lose his wife, his dowry, and his dignity. He would become a laughingstock of the court, the subject of tavern songs and cruel jokes for the rest of his life. This practice continued for centuries, a dark stain on European jurisprudence, until one famous case finally exposed its absurdity. In the 17th century, the Marquis de Langeais, a French nobleman, failed his trial by Congress. He was humiliated, stripped of his wife, and forced to pay massive costs. He was forbidden to remarry. But the Marquis was a stubborn man. He defied the court, married another woman in secret, and went on to have 7 children with her. When the courts found out, they were faced with an impossible contradiction. Here was a man they had legally declared impotent, bouncing 7 legitimate heirs on his knee. The science was wrong. The trial was a sham. The stress of the courtroom had caused the failure, not nature. This scandal was the final nail in the coffin. In 1677, France officially abolished the trial by Congress, calling it an obscenity and a source of shame for the law. As we close the book on the medieval wedding night, we have to step back and ask, why? Why did they do this? Why did they invite the village into the bedroom? Why did they inspect the sheets? Why did they traumatize couples in courtrooms? The answer lies in the harsh reality of the medieval world. To them, marriage wasn't about the individuals. It wasn't about your happiness, your sexual satisfaction, or your privacy. It was about survival. In a world without social security, without police, without stability, the family was the only fortress you had. The lineage was everything. A marriage was the merging of 2 fortresses. The heir was the soldier who would man the walls in the next generation. Therefore, the production of that heir wasn't a private hobby. It was a matter of national security. The community felt they had to police the bedroom, because if the bedroom failed, the family failed. If the family failed, the land would be lost, chaos would ensue, and the fragile order of their world would collapse. So they watched, they listened, they inspected, they judged. The medieval wedding night was a crucible. It stripped away human dignity to serve the machinery of inheritance. It turned the most intimate act of human connection into a spectator sport and a legal obligation. So, the next time you attend a wedding and you see the couple drive away with "just married" written on the car, heading to a private hotel room where no one, absolutely no one, is going to check the sheets or knock on the door, take a moment to be grateful. Be grateful that you live in an age where your bedroom has a lock. Be grateful that your love is not a business transaction. And be grateful that you will never, ever have to prove your worth to a jury of matrons. This has been the filthy, terrifying, and fascinating truth about the medieval wedding night. We have peeled back the covers of history, and what we found underneath wasn't romance. It was reality. Raw, uncomfortable, and deeply human. If you survive this entire series, from the dowry negotiations to the impotence trials, you are officially a history veteran. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark corners of the past, please destroy that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. And now, I have a question for you. We've explored the bedroom, the tavern, and the battlefield. Where should we go next? The torture chamber? The insane asylum? Or perhaps the terrifying world of medieval childbirth? Let me know in the comments below. Sleep tight and lock your doors.